Hi students, this week we're going to cover dependency injection and unit testing in ASP.NET Core. So if you're following along in the book, we've covered pretty much all of the main things we're going to need to do in order to complete our final project successfully. These last few chapters are just building upon the skills we have and to get a better understanding of exactly um, what we've been talking about this whole time and what exactly everything is doing. And then we also get into some unit testing to where once your application is finished, well, there's actually a couple different ways you could go about it. The first one being once your application is finished, you could go back and do unit testing. Make sure all of the code you wrote, if there's any business logic, you're getting correct values back. And just testing methods to ensure that all of the methods you wrote are doing exactly what you intended them to do would be one of the ways you can do it. And another way you could do it is by doing a framework that has become popular in the past, say, 10 years called test-driven development, or TDD, where actually before you begin writing any code at all, the first code you write is a test, and then you continue coding until that test passes, and that's considered test-driven development. And that way you don't have to go back. All of your code is consistent. You're consistently testing it. You're making sure as you're developing features for your website or your service or whatever it is you're developing, as you're developing, you're not introducing more bugs because there's unit tests that get ran every time it builds to make sure that the new code you wrote isn't breaking your old code. So test-driven development has become more prevalent in the more near future recently. So this first video we're going to cover dependency injection. We've already done it a little bit with databases. We're going to show dependency injection. I'm going to show it in Visual Studio with a service that I have written. So let's go ahead and you can go through the PowerPoint. The first dependency injection section isn't a lot. This is probably the only slide. Here are a few different ways you can add your dependencies inside of Visual Studio or inside of your project. You can add it transiently, you can add it scoped, or add it with a singleton, and all of those definitions are in the book on page 561. It's essentially just how the life cycle of the class that you're injecting in. Is it essentially, just for example, singleton creates a new instance of the class the first time it needs to inject a dependency and then reuses that instance for all subsequent injections. So that's just an example. So it's just essentially the life of this class. How long do you want the class to live? Scope is throughout for example, throughout the scope of the HTTP request. So I build it once, I inject in that dependency one time, and then it reuses that instance for all subsequent injections in the scope. So that's just some examples of when we're going to use these methods. So let's go ahead and jump into Visual Studio and code out what we're going to do here. So I have this program, which is my website that has my items in it again. And actually, let me make sure I get rid of everything that I don't want first. So let's go ahead. Okay, that's what I wanted to get rid of. Let's come back over here. So I have, I'm kind of doing a repository pattern here, if we remember. So I call this repository, and then the repository somewhat orchestrates how I'm going to get the item. So I want to be able to, in the repository, either call my service or call my database, if you remember. So you can see I have the ability to get all items and get all item types. And right now I get it from my database, but I want to be able to get it from my service instead. So I'm going to go ahead and come over here to, let's first go to interfaces. So here's my interfaces project. And you can see I have an interface for my database already that I'm dependency injecting in. So let's go ahead and create an interface for my service. So let's go ahead and let's call it items service proxy.cs. Let's go ahead and put it in a namespace, com.diablo2.interfaces. And then we can go ahead and give it a couple methods. So if you remember the methods from our repository, I want to go ahead and give it IEnumerable of entities.diablo2item, get all items. So first I need to include the collections framework. Then I'll probably need to include what else here? Oh, I guess I never told it that I was going to be an interface. That'd be an important thing to do. Interface, and then what is this? Items service proxy, which I probably should have named this with an I as well. So let me go ahead and say items service proxy. Now let's go ahead and tell this thing that it's going to be an interface. Okay. Okay, and then it's an interface, so I don't need to call it public, and that should be fine now. All right, now let's go ahead and create another one, IEnumerable of entities.item type, get all item types. All right, so now I have an interface to interact with my service. The next thing I can actually do is show you the service that I'm interacting with. I have it locally. I believe this is it. Service. So let me go ahead and run this, and I'll show you exactly what I'm going to be interacting with here. So I have this service running locally where I can get Diablo 2 items from it. You can see I'm using Swagger, which is an open API format where I can generate a user interface and some documentation for my service. Then it returns all of the information via JSON here. So you can see it goes out to my database and then returns all the information in a JSON format to my website here. So that's what I'm going to be interacting with. And then if I go out to here again in my website, you can see here that I have, and this is all a little bit outside of the scope of this project, and I understand that. I'm just trying to set up some dependency injection for my service here. So if we go to my proxy, we can see that I have a connected service that has all of my documentation for my service here. The ability to show a base URL, where exactly am I going to go to get to reach this service, what's it going to return, all of that good stuff. What methods can I call? And I didn't write this code. This code was auto-generated for me using a tool, a desktop application to generate open APIs via a web URL. So I passed it the web URL. In this case, it was just my local host 5001 because I had my service running locally. Then it was able to generate all of this documentation for me and all of this C# code. So it was a really useful application. So now that I have that C# code, which essentially gives me a JSON serializer, it gives me an HTTP request to work with in order to call that endpoint, and all of that good stuff that I need, now I can use that whenever I implement my interface here. So when I go and actually implement the interface inside of this proxy, I'm going to go ahead and create a new file and call it items service proxy.cs. Give it a namespace of com.diablo2.proxy public class items service proxy. And now this is going to implement our items service proxy interface. So I may need to include the interfaces project. And implement the interface. So now I have my interface. Let's go ahead and create a constructor. And within my constructor, I actually need an instance of that client that I'm going to use to call my service. So I'm going to say client, my items client, service.diablo2 items. I should probably actually change the namespace of this while I'm here. So the namespace should be service.diablo2 items.proxy. Okay, so when I come back here, using com diablo2 service. I don't want to use service. Now let's go back to it again. Sorry, just doing a little cleanup here. As this isn't inside of my service, it's inside of my website. So that should be, now what's it complaining about? I'm trying to have this same namespace. That way I don't have to import it. Okay, and there it sees it inside of the same namespace now. What don't you... I don't understand why it would have needed to implement the interface again. So here's my interface. Where's my items service proxy here? Here it is. It doesn't have an interface connected to it. So if I get rid of these, let's get rid of these. Let's make these public. It's implementing it explicitly, which I don't know why. Okay, that looks to have fixed it. All right, let's go ahead and use this client. So let's say the client equals a new items client. And then if you look, I actually need to pass it an HTTP client. So I'm just going to go ahead and new up an HTTP client to send to it. Okay, and then let's go ahead and implement this. So I'm just going to leave this one not implemented for now. Excuse me. And I'm going to go ahead and say items equals client dot. So if you look, we can call get async, which will get all of our items asynchronously. And then I want to call dot result. That way it gets it now instead of doing a lazy loading. And then I'm going to call dot to list. And I might actually need to import system.link to do that. Then I'm going to return items.select. So I'm going to map my items over to another type, new entities Diablo2 item. I'm just mapping it to a type that I have inside of this. And I can say the name equals the name coming from my service. Okay, so I have that. Now I need to implement this in my Diablo2 repository. So let's go ahead and go here, and then I can say item service proxy. Let me go ahead and inject it in here. Item service proxy. Put a comma there instead of a semicolon. And I can say that my internal proxy is equal to the proxy that's being injected in. And then This is my add operation for my database. What I need to do is come down here and say return proxy dot get all items. And then here I want to say return proxy dot get all item types. So essentially all I'm doing is I'm trying to return the proxy get all item types, and if for whatever reason an exception occurs, like it's not currently running, then get it from the database. So if I don't have my service running locally, go ahead and get those items from my database instead of trying to go out to the service. Okay, so now that I have all of that configured, I need to go to my startup and actually dependency inject it in, and I can do that because I have an interface that or I have a class that implements an interface. So I can come here, and inside of my configure services, I can say services.add scoped. And essentially what I'm saying here is whenever a class asks for an item service proxy, return to them an instance of my items service proxy class. So now when I come to my repository, you can see I say give me an instance of item service proxy, and then set that equal to it here. And essentially what that is saying is go to the container of all of the dependencies inside of my project and see if you can find this interface. If you can find this interface, give me the associated class instance of it, and exactly how long of a lifetime would you like to give it. Would you like to give it a scoped lifetime, or a singleton lifetime, or a transient lifetime, or whatever the case may be. And then they call it an IoC container, or inversion of control, or it's also called DI for dependency injection. So we look at this IoC container, and that contains all of the dependencies that can be injected in, and also the scope or the lifetime you see that we added here in the startup.cs file. So exactly which dependencies should we add to the container? So we have database dependencies, we have repository, we have proxies, all kinds of dependencies we can add in this configure services section that we can then dependency inject into our website or whatever the case may be. So then when we run our application, I should be able to get an instance of this item service proxy and then reach out to that proxy and get items back via JSON from my database. So I hope this was a good overview of dependency injection and exactly what all happens when we use dependency injection and we're adding services inside of our configure services section, and all of the magic that kind of happens behind the scenes in the .NET world. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned a lot, and then I'll see you in the next video where we'll cover a little bit of unit testing.